It's a bumpy road to 2% inflation. I'm Lisa Bernhard with Reuters, and I'm joined today by Melissa Brown. She is Managing Director of Applied Research at SimCorp, and she will talk today about today's inflation data and a lot more. Melissa, we had the latest consumer price index numbers out today, and there was a little bit of an uptick in inflation overall in December. Explain what we saw in the numbers.
Well, yes, there was a little bit of an uptick. I think one of the reasons that we saw an uptick is that we actually saw December of last year, we saw a very low month-over-month number, and therefore the comparison to this year was a little tougher. So it's not surprising that we would have seen a bit of an uptick. The numbers seem to come mainly from, or I think it was 2/3 of it came from increased housing costs. I think that is actually one reason to not be particularly worried or concerned that inflation is turning around and going back up. I think there's some lag in the way that housing costs are accounted for in the inflation numbers. And we've actually seen, if you look at other measures of housing costs, they're actually coming down.
What else specifically can you call out? Because when you strip out those volatile gas and food prices, what are we seeing in that core number?
I think, the core number was pretty much as expected. And I'm always a little wary of actually stripping out those volatile prices because, yes, they are volatile and they are going to introduce volatility to the inflation numbers, but they do impact the other things that go into inflation. So if energy prices are higher, for example, that means cost of delivering goods is higher. It means, cost of heating your home is higher. And so while I think the better way to look at it is maybe keep those numbers in, but don't just focus on 1 month's number.
The market reaction, however, was pretty definitive. Stocks went down. They're still down, although they're paring some of those losses. Do you think that this changes the market's expectation of when the Fed cuts rates and how often?
Well, if you look at the data, specifically that's put out by the CME and their FedWatch tool, there has been no change in the expectation for if and when the Fed is going to start to cut rates. So I don't think it's necessarily, you might just have one side not talking to the other. So what's happening in the bond market is not necessarily what's being reflected in the stock market, which is not unusual. I think, it does seem to be a bit of an overreaction.
There's a general understanding that the CPI is actually not the inflation data that the Federal Reserve looks at most closely, that's really the personal consumption expenditures index. So how does today's inflation data really weigh in the Fed's decision making?
Well, I think the advantage of the CPI is that it's reported more frequently. And so it does give you more data points. And so I would imagine, and I'm obviously not sitting in on Fed meetings, but I would imagine they don't completely ignore it. They probably use it as a guide to what to expect with the next PCE report.
Let's switch to company news because today Microsoft overtook Apple as the most valuable company in the world by market cap. What is the significance of that to you?
I don't think there's any particular significance. I could imagine that if we, go over the next few months, you're going to see those two going back and forth in terms of who's the biggest. I think what's much more important is how big they are and how concentrated the US market is in relatively few names. So whether it's Microsoft or Apple, who's the biggest today, is much less important than the fact that the two of them together account for a huge amount of the overall capitalization of the US market. And then you add in a few more names and that number gets even bigger, obviously. Historically, when we've seen this kind of concentration, whether it was the Nifty 50 or whether it was energy stocks in the 80s or some other examples of the market becoming much more highly concentrated, that is usually not a good thing for stocks in general. Because if you think that the values of these stocks, these stocks are not cheap. If something happens and we start to see a turnaround in their fortunes, they're going to pull the whole market down with them.